Gus Powell is a New York City-based photographer known for his sharp observational eye. He was named one of PDN's 30 under 30 in 2003, and his work has been exhibited internationally, including a solo show at the Museum of the City of New York. His photographs have appeared in Aperture, Harpers, Vogue, Le Mans M magazine, Wired, Fortune, W, and The New Yorker. A longtime member of the international street photography collective UP, Gus also teaches at the School of Visual Arts in New York City. His monograph, The Lonely Ones, was widely celebrated as one of the year's best photography books. And today on the Crit House, Gus Powell shares his myFIVE, inspirations drawn from the work of Charles Harbut, Frank O'Hara, Jacques Tati, William Steig, and Jacob Lawrence.
Without a doubt, the DNA of who I am as a photographer and as a visual artist is that of a street photographer. You know, that's what I cut my teeth on, that language, that way of trying to pick up fragments of the world and bring them home, you know. But even before I was doing that with a camera, I was doing it just on the streets of New York. You know, I used to love picking up, you know, garbage, objects that had been flattened, you know, all these sorts of things. So this long existing dialogue I've had with the city and life in public space. And as someone who's absolutely, you know, the visual literacy was always much farther along than my ability to read and write, but I was always paying attention to the world and sucking it for as much as I could possibly get. And then discovering photography as a way to do that really efficiently, you know, both as, you know, it's this small machine that you carry with you and that you can grab something with and then come back home with it. And then also just as this prompt to pay more attention to life around you in different ways, you know, and what could be happening in any given moment that is compelling. So, you know, street photography as a phrase is, you know, I find it to be particularly limp. You know, it doesn't, it's not a very robust phrase. When it is, it ends up becoming very macho and kind of masculine and aggressive. And it seems that that's not really the tradition I come from. I definitely come from a more poetic tradition, you know, and there are people within, you know, the history of photography, street photography, that I think also lean that way, you know, coming from France and then maybe getting into Frank and then Meyerowitz and others. And then, of course, then I wear other hats. You know, a street photographer is what I am, but I've used those skills in different ways and deployed them in different ways, you know, whether it's to do editorial work, fashion work, commercial work. So you have all of that that's linked to who I am. And definitely I am who I am because of where I grew up. You know, to a certain degree, I think of street photography as being an indigenous handicraft of New York. You know, if I was from the Catchcar Mountains, I might knit beautiful socks and sweaters. But that's what I do because that's how we interact with New York. But going past that, it's about communication, right? So it's about how to tell a story, you know, and looking for something that awakens something in me that maybe makes me ask a question or gives me a little bit of a goosebump, and to try and find a way to hold on to that and then communicate that sensation, that experience to others in a different way, whether that's in a singular image, which is sort of the tradition of street photography, or working with pictures in a sequence. So that larger objective of being a communication artist, a storyteller, is really, you know, the bigger piece of it. But it all started with, you know, pointing a small loaded camera at people.
All of that came out of somewhere. You were influenced by things that brought you to where you are, and that's what we're here to talk about in the myFIVE series. You chose 5 images. How did you go about, or images or works of art in your case, and so how did you go about deciding what those 5 images would be?
Yeah, you know, and again, I definitely pivoted a little bit from images, right? You know, because I know that some of your past folks have maybe been very hard and true to very specific images. And, you know, that could be one path for me. And maybe at different points in my life, I would have responded in that way. But I think, you know, in wanting to share 5 objects, works of art, or things that have inspired me, you know, I reached for things that in some ways were landmarks for me at different times, and that made me think about photography and communicating in a new way, rather than it just being envious, you know, of, that love affair I had with Larry Towell for a year and a half when I was trying to make one of those pictures, or, when I wanted to really figure out the 28 millimeter and, whatever that is. So rather than getting into the weeds on some of those kind of technical and maybe graphic pursuits, And of course, those types of images also have narrative and
Sure.
emotional values that can be discussed. Absolutely. But in some ways, pivoting away from just sort of picking five singles, five images that I am envious of or love or have been inspired by, I tried to sort of pick things that in some ways maybe move the needle in a bigger way for me. And that expanded my idea of what could be done with the medium and what I could do as a human being by, trying to work with a camera.
Well, let's go take a look at your myFIVE. So we start with a book from Frank O'Hara, Lunch Poems, and I believe that this is a direct reference to one of your more significant projects.
Well, yeah. So, when I was after college and I was working in Midtown Manhattan and I was beginning to make these photographs on the street and I didn't, of course I knew what street photography was and it was a part of what I was doing, but I was just sort of making pictures on my way to work, during lunch hour, after work. And I had recently become quite close to Joel Meyerowitz, who became sort of a huge mentor to me in so many different ways and a dear friend. And so he was very encouraging in terms of just the types of pictures I was trying to make and to keep sort of pursuing it. But that kind of open-endedness of, when can I do it? Where should I be making pictures? I felt that there was some lack of focus in that. And then at a certain point, a dear friend of mine from college, Emily Kane, she was a classmate of mine at Oberlin and a poet. She just sent me this book in the mail, and I didn't know Frank O'Hara. I had never studied him in the past. And the book arrived, and those of you that know it, it's one of these, city lights. It's a tiny little book, right? It's the size of a passport.
Well,
And I looked at these poems, and the backstory on them is that, Frank O'Hara at the time was working at the Museum of Modern Art as a curator, and he would go out of the museum and go to Fifth Avenue and go to the Olivetti typewriter showroom and put in a piece of paper, and he would write a poem, and then he'd fold it up and put it in his pocket and continue with his day. And the nature of the poems, they are, they are documentary in nature, but they're really documents of him trying to feel something on his lunch hour, right?
hmm.
So there's observations and there's quotations. He talks about, neon and daylight and then watching the way a woman's skirt flutters or the way a shirtless man's chest glistens. And then he talks about the errands he's trying to run and how he's getting ready for the weekend ahead, and then he'll talk about the news that's happened that day. So this book, it really, it gave me permission to say, this is enough to work with. 10 minutes out the door, right? But going out and then because time and space was limited, it forced me to look for less and less of an event to be significant. Just people walking past each other, right? Just people waiting, and then sometimes there's the white elephant or there's the kiss or the fall, so there's a couple pictures in that body of work, which became this book, The Company of Strangers. And so this sort of permission to make a picture that's about less and less, that could just be about light and just the crisscross of people. And that book really, it was in my pocket, and it wasn't like I was rereading the poems every day, but it was this little object of a totem, to sort of say, there's enough in this to just feel something and to come back with it. Right. But, I put it there right at the beginning because, again, I find it so useful to take inspiration from people who are not practicing your same medium. The nature of the conversation you can have and the nature of what you can take away from something that is not your medium, but is still communicating effectively and is inspiring to you, that it does something you wish you could do with your work, is so useful. And so that's what Lunch Poems really did for me.
I love that. Love it. So your second is also not photography, The Lonely Ones from William Steig. Talk about this, sir.
Yeah, so again, Steig is really famous for certain things, in terms of his pop culture moment. He was the creator of Shrek, which became a very massive film and series, but before that, he was a high level New Yorker cartoonist, and then he's also very famous for a whole collection of award-winning, Caldecott Prize children's books. Pizza Pizza, ABC or C to B, and so many wonderful books. And again, those books were not a part of my childhood.
Yeah.
It was when I was working at the New Yorker magazine at the time, and one of my best friends, Andy Friedman, wonderful artist, musician, he was the assistant to the cartoon editor, and so he introduced me to William Steig by way of about a 4-inch stack of original drawings.
Wow.
Because Steig was unhappy because the New Yorker hadn't been publishing too much, and he was constantly submitting, and so he said, "I want everything back," So my friend Andy showed me, he said, "You have to look at these
Before they
drawings;
go.
they're just amazing," and because Steig wants them back. And I went through these drawings, and they just kind of crushed me, in their attention to detail, in the union of text and image, the nuance, paying attention to humanity, the clown in the truest sense, how we make mistakes, we get into trouble, we say the wrong thing, we fall, we get up. And I went through these original drawings, with their scratchy lines, and sometimes you tried to figure out if you wrote the caption first or if the drawing came first. And there was one specific drawing that I don't think was ever published, and it was a picture of a mailbox. And at the bottom of the mailbox, there were just a couple little weeds. And then there was a ripped up letter, you know, no person, just that piece of detritus at this destination that it didn't quite make it into. And then the caption was a change of heart.
Oh,
And it just like gutted me. Do you know what I mean? And it just gutted
that
me,
hurts.
and it gutted me, and it was like I remember it like feeling it in my stomach, and I remember saying like I want to do that. Like I want to like pay attention to that. That idea that some human being wrote the I'm sorry letter or whatever it is,
Yeah.
went to all the trouble, put the stamp on it, put an address on it, walked all the way up to the mailbox, which is not that different than a trash can in some ways, right?
Right. Yeah.
And stood there and then gave up and
Oh,
had that change of heart, right? To choose not to communicate something.
yeah.
And then looking through all these drawings, I just got really moved by his work. And I was lucky enough to be friends with several other New Yorker cartoonists, and I would show them photographs. And when we would walk around the city or have lunch together, they had the same attention to humanity,
Hmm.
and the same attention to a lived experience in public space, looking for private moments in public space, having your ears wide open for any little thing that could result in a cartoon. There was this wonderful man, Michael Crawford, fantastic cartoonist. I remember once, he walked in and he had a lot of vitality and personality. He walked in and he said, "Oh, I like your shirt, kid." And I said, "Yeah, that's my dinner with dad shirt." And then like he took the pencil out thing and he read like, "You just made me $500." And then he walked away. Uh, and I don't think the cartoon was bought, but that attention of always watching. So pushing forward, I then started to dig into William Steig, and I went into the New Yorker library and I started looking at the books. And then this book just bowled me away, because first of all, it's a tiny little thing, right?
Yep.
It was hugely successful in its time, like 14 printings. He was inspiring, the work was inspiring, the practice was inspiring. And I had this wonderful poetry teacher in college, David Young, who had this kind of advice when he said, when you're struggling to figure out what it is you're trying to communicate, pick something that has very strict rules, the constraints, right? So pick a sonnet, something that has, very strict rules. And then because you can't go in whatever direction, you have to then fill that existing form with whatever you can to try to get to the end of the day. And the way I took that is that I decided, well, I don't quite know what to do with these pictures, but I'm gonna do a cover album of this book, right? So the very first version I made, I literally glued my pictures into his book, and that
Huh.
was the first draft of the book. So long story short, it took a long time, but then eventually I ended up, same way I collected things I heard, I took things from movies and TV, and then, the final result and the final design, my book, again, exactly the same size, right?
Same coloration.
Same coloration. And also, this has, like this kind of uh, buckram kind of cover, and then the final, and it has language, but the final design element, which was, that was the last thing to come in, so it kind of made it worth was how to sort of not make it be didactic, how to separate text and image. So I'd seen a very small book in an Airbnb house that we stayed in, and it was this tiny little book about the paintings of Dufay. And in the book, it had maybe 20 pages. Every time it showed a painting, it had a gatefold. And I thought,
Oh,
well, that's interesting, like to have
yeah.
such a small book with a gatefold. So, and I had made versions of my book where the pictures got murdered in the gutter, and my friends were like, "You can't do that. It's like
Right.
killing."
Right. Right.
So I was like, well, what if I did that?
That's cool.
And what if I then that the text and image wouldn't be so didactic? They would kind of exist in different spaces, so that they can still sort of cohabitate and inspire one another, but not necessarily one overpowering the other. And then I was doing a lot of work doing book jackets at times. So we know these pictures that are kind of pregnant with a quality, but that don't necessarily say Paris or Boston,
Right.
but they have an emotional quality and they're waiting for typography to sit on them, So I was thinking about that type of work to a certain degree, and then trying to come up with a form that's both kind of playful and charming, and obviously that maybe references more. It looks more like a book of poetry than a book of photography.
So your number three, playtime, right?
Yeah, so Jacques Tati is this incredible, French artist. When I'm watching people in public space, you're always looking for signs of some kind of interior experience that they're having, or at the very least, you're looking for that there might be some quality in the photograph you made that alludes to that. Whether or not it was there or not is
Hmm.
debatable. But the way, you watch, you pick a random street corner and you watch, anytime you see somebody carrying, something that's hard to carry, it's the clown. And we're also, so there's literally those things that are kind of the low-hanging fruit of street photography, right? Somebody carrying a mirror, somebody carrying balloons, somebody with too many dogs,
Yes.
because it's a problem to solve.
Hmm.
And then, as and I always say this, of course you make those pictures, but then, the next step is like, well, what if you can't see the problems that they're solving, but you feel them, and somehow you're registering that. And then at a certain point, I discovered Playtime, and I was lucky enough to see it on 70 millimeter because it was a 70 millimeter film. And Tati largely funded it on his own, and they built this entire, sets like what you see here. There's no CGI in that massive undertaking in terms of what he built. And it's, if you wrote down how many words are said in the film across its whatever it is, 90 minutes, it's very thin. It is
Huh.
largely an observational film. And it's this collision of modernity. It's definitely a critique of modernity. For example, in the Museum of Modern Art, for a while, I don't know if it's still up, in the sort of the way that they've rehung things, where it's very interdisciplinary, where they might have a piece of a Corbusier of architecture, and they might have an Ezra Stoller photograph, and then they also will have a scene from Playtime. Because there's these incredible all glass buildings, with the sort of alienating furniture, but then you go out on the sidewalk and then there's still the French woman selling flowers.
Yeah.
It's a boy meets girl story to some degree. And then there's a restaurant that opens that gets into all kind of trouble with people getting bombed. And then there's problems and problems and problems being solved throughout it. But it's a visual delight, right? It's just an actual visual and sonic delight. I've referenced this a few times. There was some place where somebody asked, where do you most wish you could go photograph? And I said, in the city of Jacques Tati's Playtime. Um, it's a role model of sorts in terms of interacting with the world around you, both when it becomes challenging and feels difficult, but also both when, that breeze comes and you get the smile from somebody and you see a reflection in a piece of light that feels fantastic and you feel like there's hope.
Your fourth moves on to painting with Jacob Lawrence in this series, the migration series.
Yeah, so I've always loved this work, right? I mean, and if you just look at this, and maybe we have an intelligent photo community that's hopefully paying attention to us in some capacity. Like my favorite Robert Frank picture is Canal Street, with all of those people going left and right, and Jason Eskenazi did that lovely book where he asked all these different photographers, what their favorite Frank picture was. And it was kind of fun because I feel like we all got to, okay, who are the other people who love Canal Street, and picked that, and I know that Joel Meyerowitz picked it. And I was like, of course, like, well, yeah, that's whatever, but that one picture has inspired me immensely, right? And it's a picture I continue to try and make in different ways again and again and again. And then seeing this Jacob Lawrence work, which I've crossed paths with it, many times in my life. But the scale of them, if you look at, you look at this, it feels photographic, right? You can feel the movement
Totally.
of it. The title of the work is Migrations. This is work, obviously, by a Black artist making work that is about a very specific moment in America from their voice and populated by his people. So that narrative structure, but then the aesthetics, right? The edges of the frame, this muted color palette, and you could flip this image sideways and upside down, and there would be pleasure to it, right? Just all that rhythm, and again, having some text when there is text there. So I'm working on a project now. I'm obviously, slightly obsessed with making pictures of figures, head to toe, about 12 feet away. My pleasure point is like 7 or more people in a frame, and then trying to build a story where there is no story, right? This
Yeah.
work very much has a story to it. But even without that story, every individual piece is really quite beautiful, especially these ones that are very kinetic to me, and then this is a book maquette that I'm working on now that's kind of underway, and again, it's another book that has a conceptual delivery system. It's pretending to be a Deutsche Grammophon record, right? So both in terms of form to sort of justify being 12 by 12 inches,
right.
but then also to make you think, what if you thought of a set of photographs as a piece of individual pieces of music, and what if you had the idea of a prelude as a prompt? And I've been thinking about this work a lot, but I mean, this is definitely me like riffing on, Jacob Lawrence, and then, New York, for a long time, it mostly had these blue walls, and then they kind of migrated to these green walls. But I mean, that can of paint is pretty close to what he does. And again, head to toe, the mixture of different types of people that are in the city, and trying to tell a story of lived experience outside at this specific moment in time.
Yeah.
And then wanting the individual pictures, there's some, this one gets maybe more into sort of Bruegel territory, because the birds up top kind of help. So again, taking references from painting, thinking about other things, and we know what we like. I love it when people touch buildings, right? Like everyone should have their lists of little things that turn them on. But yeah, so that work, I've just been thinking about it a lot. So taking inspiration from this work in many different ways, the color palette, the rhythm of it, that it's describing a lived experience in public space. And then, also the power of this is not portrait work, right? He has some that there'll be a single protagonist, but the facelessness of these people, they are just identified by their dark skin, right? You get personalities from different hats and different gestures, but even looking at this one, look at how they're all leaning in. These are all very specific, and they almost, if you look at this, and it almost looks like they could all be on cell phones. And I don't say that as a joke. There is a pronated chin there that I associate with life in public space of people on their phone. And that is a micro little detail that I'm just kind of seeing for the first time looking at it. That is absolutely intentional, and the same way we have intent with how the pictures we choose and why, those gestures. Why is this little awkward gesture? Why does it do something? Why does it say more than if that foot was touching all the way or not touching? So the details of things, especially when you see work like this that could be added to and removed from, which is more complicated in us as lens-based artists, right? You can't necessarily work that way. You can if you work with sort of post-production and such, but the details, how do those little micro details mean everything, right?
So your last work takes us now into photography, and out of all of the images that have ever been made, this is the one you have chosen to discuss. So tell us about this and Charles Harbut.
Like I said at the beginning, I could have easily just picked 5 killer pictures that I love. This is a picture that I often show at different times, and I always come back to it. It's it's a blind boy feeling the light. And when I saw this picture, I thought it was beautiful right off the bat. And then I also thought that's a tough picture to print. And then I saw the title and I just was so moved, the same way I talk about the way I was moved when I saw that drawing by William Steig with that caption that said a change of heart. To see this, because all of us, especially this time of year or the past few weeks, if you're from the Northeast, when we're in that time of year when the sun starts to come, but the air is still cold.
Yes,
right?
you can feel the heat of the light.
One side of your face, is hot and the other side is cold. And seeing this image that was just beautiful from the beginning, but then to have that other little piece of information and to think of this child, this young person feeling for that vein, right? Trying to touch the void, right?
Yeah.
And so for me, it's not so much I have this picture because it's a picture I wish I make, but I have it as just deeply inspiring. To me, this is what every photographer is trying to do. We're trying to feel this unseen thing, and we traffic in light and shadow largely, right? And time, and who knows? What was this, a crack through a door that was open? What is this vein of light that we can't? It's completely devoid of other context, which is part of the picture's success, And then I even think the work of art up on the wall and the fact that it's black and white, the dreariness of it. And then even the little gestures, the black suspenders being sort of the same width, it's built from a bunch of really lovely elements. But this act of trying to feel something that can't be seen, right? That's what the photography, that's what great photographs do. They show you more than that's there. They are not built just from the bricks and mortar and the flesh and bones and the light and shadow. The really great images have something else. And it feels like the sort of metaphor of every photographer. It's this perfect act of being young and naive and maybe trying to make work like that's on the wall, but not even seeing that and trying to
Yeah.
feel and
Yeah.
describe something that is unseeable.
So before we started the program, you asked me the why of why I'm doing the Crit House and the myFIVE series specifically. You have just encapsulated it with this photograph and how you talked about that. About that there is something that is more meaningful than what you're seeing on the screen itself. And there's meaning and there's metaphor and there's poetry in this that if you're flying through on Instagram, you're not going to see. So it's beautifully, and it was beautifully stated. Thank you. You have just done what I'm trying to do on the Crit House. Thanks for that.
Well, you can close it down now. You're done.
All right, there we go. Gus Powell, what a pleasure to talk to you about the five works of art, five things. You're the first person to have cartoons on the Crit House, which was a pleasure to talk about. I'm sure cartoon is not the best way to refer to that body of work, but that's what I did. Thank you
No
so much.
problem. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Thank you so much. A pleasure to meet you. Thank you so much for having me, and good luck with all of it. Yeah, I hope we can all keep finding this little vein of light together. So,
me too. Oh,
yeah,
well done.
yeah.
And thank you all for watching the Crit House.